They say that on certain nights, when the mist rolls heavy across the moors of Northumberland, you can hear the sound of marching feet. Not the footsteps of living men, but the ironclad tread of a legion long dead. Farmers once swore they saw them spectral figures, heads held high, shields and spears glinting in moonlight that could not touch them. The watchers of Hadrian's wall, they were called a ghostly garrison, condemned to patrol a frontier that no longer exists. It was only a story, of course, until archaeologists began to uncover what the wall had truly meant, and what life had demanded of those stationed there. Welcome, traveler, to the Archive of Folly. Here we gather the echoes of human ambition, the scars of stone and story alike. Tonight, we walk with the legionaries of Rome's northernmost frontier, a wall raised to hold back a world Rome could never conquer. Together we will see the wall as it was, not just a line of stone, but a living scar, filled with voices that history could not silence. If you find comfort in histories that breathe like legends, where myth and memory entwine, then I invite you to join us here in the archive. And if you wish to walk these paths with us again, you may subscribe, so that the voices of the past are never far from reach. Hadrian's Wall, 117 kilometers of stone, stretching from the mouth of the Tyne to the Solway Firth. To the Romans, it was the edge of the known world. To those who lived along its length, it was both prison and sanctuary. And to those who stood watch upon it, it was the narrow ground between life and death. Imagine arriving here as a young recruit, conscripted from the provinces, perhaps a boy from Gaul, or a man dragged from the warm hills of Spain, suddenly thrust into the wind-scoured emptiness of Britain's north. You would have carried the weight of Rome on your shoulders, and yet you were thousands of miles from its heart. The wall was ordered by Hadrian himself, the restless emperor who sought to define the empire's limits. Rome, he knew, could not expand forever. It had swallowed too much already: Egypt, Syria, Dacia, Gaul. But here, in Britain, expansion had reached its end. The tribes beyond, the Caledonians, were wild and unyielding. They did not bend to Rome as easily as others had. And so Hadrian made a choice. He would not break himself upon the wilderness. He would build a wall instead. But a wall is more than stone. It is the men who guard it, who suffer for it, who bleed upon it. In the early years, construction was brutal. Soldiers hauled limestone blocks, timber, and turf across barren hills. The moors were wet with fog and rain, and the cold bit through leather and wool. Men wrote letters home, scratching words on thin wooden tablets. Some begged for supplies. "I ask you, send more socks, more sandals, more underclothes." Others wrote of longing, of the crushing boredom between patrols. One officer's wife invited a friend to her birthday feast, proof that even on this frontier, Romans sought warmth and joy. And yet, alongside these small human moments, there was always the shadow of violence. Because beyond the wall, the world seethed. The tribes of the north tested Rome's resolve. Raids struck in the night. Smoke rose in the distance. A wall cannot keep out ghosts, and it cannot silence the cries of the conquered. The soldiers knew this. Every stone they lifted was not only for defense, but for show. A monument to Rome's will, carved into a land that had never asked for it. And here, the legend begins to stir. Centuries later, when the empire was gone, villagers swore they still heard the tramp of legionary boots in the dead of night. What is a haunting, if not memory refusing to fade? Imagine the soldier on a midnight watch, staring out into darkness. His torch flickers. He hears movement in the heather. Is it an enemy scout? A wolf? Or only the wind? He cannot know. But he grips his spear tighter, because at the wall, the line between safety and death was thinner than a breath. That tension, the ever-present waiting, lived in their bones. Perhaps it is still there, walking the night roads of memory. To live at the wall was to dwell in contrasts. Inside the forts, life imitated Rome. There were bathhouses with warm steam, temples with flickering lamps, and workshops filled with clatter. Officers' quarters echoed with laughter, feasts, the clinking of wine cups. And yet, step outside the gates, and the wilderness swallowed everything. The cries of curlews, the endless sky, the whisper of peat bogs. Civilization ended in a single stride, and beyond it lay the unknown. Soldiers wrote curses on lead tablets, calling on the gods to punish thieves. They buried altars to Mithras, god of light and darkness, hoping he might see them through the long winters. And when men fell in battle or sickness, they were laid in stone tombs, facing south toward the empire, toward home. The frontier does something strange to the human heart. It stretches time, distorts memory. A soldier standing watch might feel both trapped and immoral. And centuries later, when locals whispered of the watchers' phantom legions that never left, it was not hard to believe. For what else would remain of men who gave their lives to a wall of stone? The wall itself endured. Even as Rome's power waned, the stones held firm. Farmers stole blocks to build cottages. Sheep wandered the old roads. Yet still the wall marked the land, as if Rome's shadow could not be erased. And in that shadow, stories grew. There is one tale of a Roman cohort seen marching through a cellar in York. Ghostly men, visible only from the knees up, their lower legs buried in the ancient ground level of the road. The witnesses swore it true. Were they seeing echoes, or only the weight of history pressed into their minds? And so we return again and again to the same question. Did the soldiers truly leave? Or does the act of guarding, so deeply etched into their existence, bind them to the frontier still? Perhaps it is not the dead who haunt the wall, but the living, carrying their memory forward in each whispered tale. This is where we begin our watch alongside them, in the cold and endless night of empire. The first breath of winter on the wall was always the hardest. The wind came sweeping down from the north, driving sleet that cut like knives against exposed skin. Fires were tended constantly, but the cold seeped into every stone, every blanket, every soldier's marrow. For men born in warmer provinces, Africa, Spain, Syria, the shock was unbearable. Some wrote bitterly of it. Others turned inward, clinging to ritual, to the faint glow of religion and memory. On their lips, the gods of the Mediterranean were invoked: Jupiter for strength, Mars for courage, Mithras for light. But here, at the end of the world, they must have wondered if their gods could even hear them. And yet, despite the suffering, the wall became its own strange world. Archaeology reveals dice scattered in barracks, suggesting that soldiers gambled to pass the endless hours. Fragments of writing show requests for hunting nets and beer. The forts were not silent prisons. They were living places filled with arguments, laughter, and longing. Some soldiers took local wives or concubines. Children were born in shadow of the wall, half Romang, half Briton. These children grew up hearing two languages, two ways of life. Perhaps they were the first to realize that the wall was not just a barrier. It was also a place of exchange, of mingling, of uneasy coexistence. But Rome's shadow was heavy, and the tribes beyond never stopped testing it. They moved like smoke across the hills, raiding villages, striking suddenly, disappearing into the forests. Roman patrols rode out, their armor creaking, shields shining in the torchlight. But they could not master the wilderness, as they had mastered cities and fields elsewhere. The land itself seemed to resist them. To the soldiers, this must have felt like a living enemy bogs that swallowed men whole. Rivers that froze, forests that echoed with war cries. No wonder that, centuries later, when locals told of phantom cohorts still walking the line, they imagined them locked in an eternal struggle with the land itself. What makes a ghost endure? Is it unfinished duty? Is it the memory of fear? replayed again and again until the earth itself remembers? Picture a soldier in the year 142, when Hadrian's successor Antoninus Pius briefly abandoned the wall to push further north. For a brief moment, the garrisons left their posts, venturing into unknown country. But the Antonine Wall, further north, proved fragile, untenable. Within a generation, the soldiers marched back south, returning to Hadrian's Wall, to the stones they had once abandoned. Imagine their feelings, returning to the same barracks, the same posts, the same narrow watchtowers, as if the land itself had forced them back. Perhaps this bred the sense that there was no escape, that they would never leave this frontier, even in death. By the 3rd century, Rome was fracturing. The empire strained under civil wars, invasions, and plague. Yet the wall endured, held by soldiers whose names we will never know. They inscribed altars, they carved graffiti, they prayed for victory in battles that never made the chronicles. One dedication reads, "To Jupiter Optimus Maximus, for the welfare of the emperor, the unit of Aurelian's horse." The words are simple, but they carry the weight of men pleading for survival. Did they believe the gods listened? Or did they feel the silence pressing in, like the endless moors that surrounded them? And always, the mythic thread runs beneath. A story survives from the Middle Ages of monks and farmers who avoided walking alone by the ruins of the wall at night. They claimed that Roman soldiers still patrolled there, armed and unyielding, not monstrous, not malevolent, but present, watching, guarding a boundary that no longer mattered. Their shields made no sound, their helmets gleamed, though no fire lit them. These were the Watchers, the shades of empire that refused to yield. We must ask ourselves, were such stories simply born of fear, of imagination playing tricks in the moonlight? Or were they something deeper folk memory, the human mind carrying forward the weight of what had once been endured? Because the truth is, the wall was not forgotten. Even after Rome abandoned Britain in the early 5th century, the stones stood, and those who lived nearby could not help but wonder, who had built such a thing? Why had they left? And where had the soldiers gone? When answers are missing, myth rushes in to fill the silence. Inside the forts, traces of daily life still whisper. Shoes of every size, from a child's tiny leather sandal to the broad boots of cavalrymen, have been unearthed in the damp soil. Some shoes were patched again and again, signs of poverty and endurance. Others, decorated with elaborate patterns, belonged to officers or their families. The wall was not only a military frontier, it was a place where families lived and died. Think of the child, playing near the barracks, hearing the clang of armor, the barking of orders. For that child, Rome was not the eternal city, but this strip of stone and earth, this meeting place of cultures, this endless horizon. Perhaps the Watchers are not only soldiers. Perhaps the ghosts are mothers, children, lovers, all bound to the wall because it was their entire world. As we move through this story, we begin to feel the repetition. Each generation of soldiers lived the same cycle. Arrival from distant lands, shock at the cold, the struggle to endure, the mingling with locals, the endless waiting, the occasional clash of blood, and then death, burial, replacement. And through it all, the wall stood. It absorbed their lives like a sponge absorbs water, until the stone itself seemed to carry memory. That is why the legends are so persistent, because the wall is more than ruins. It is a grave, a monument, and perhaps a prison. And still the question lingers. Why did Hadrian build it? Was it truly to keep the tribes at bay? Or was it to keep the empire itself from dissolving, a psychological barrier as much as a military one? An emperor sought control over chaos, and in doing so, he chained thousands of lives to this desolate place. The folly of empire is not always in the battles lost. Sometimes it is in the human cost of merely standing still. And if, in the darkness, Men still march where they once marched before. Can we call that anything other than the echo of Rome itself, refusing to be forgotten? The centuries turned, and still the wall endured, like a scar across the northern wilds. In times of Roman strength, it thrummed with life. Banners snapping in the wind, torches burning along the turrets, the clang of the blacksmith's hammer echoing into the night. In times of weakness, it sagged into silence, stones cracking, barracks empty, weeds sprouting in the parade ground. And yet, even in ruin, the wall was never abandoned entirely. Some garrisons remained, stubborn as the stone they lived among. The watchers did not vanish all at once. They faded, cohort by cohort, as the empire itself frayed. By the 4th century, the soldiers knew the world was shifting beneath their feet. Rumors filtered in from the south, emperors rising and falling like autumn leaves, barbarian armies pressing against the Rhine, plagues spreading through the provinces. And still the orders came. Hold the frontier, hold the line. To the men stationed there, it must have felt like being stranded on an island, cut off from the heart of Rome, forgotten by the masters they still served. Perhaps that explains the weariness found in their final inscriptions dedications, not to conquest or glory, but to simple survival. One fragmentary tablet tells us of repairs ordered by a centurion. Not new walls, not great fortifications, but the patching of old gates, the mending of broken tiles. It reads like the last desperate care of men keeping up appearances, painting the shutters of a house that is already collapsing. Yet even in such decline, they clung to ritual. They continued to sacrifice to the gods, to light incense, to hold fast to the symbols of a Rome that was slipping away. The myth of Rome eternal, unbreakable, was their shield against despair. But myth cannot stop hunger, nor can it fend off the tribes who knew the empire's grip was loosening. Raids grew bolder. Smoke rose more often on the horizon. A soldier standing watch in those final days must have felt the land pressing in closer than ever. Each torch that flickered in the dark could be a friend, or it could be the first spark of an enemy host. Each howl of the wind might mask the approach of men. To live like that, year after year, is to be haunted in life long before death comes. And so, it is no wonder that the legend of the Watchers was born. Those who came after farmers, shepherds, monks looked upon the wall and sensed it was not empty. How could it be? Too much blood, too much vigilance had seeped into the stone. The story grew that at night, the soldiers marched still, not in rage, not in sorrow, but in duty. They had guarded once, and so they would guard forever. The most famous tale comes from York, long after the Romans had gone. A workman digging in a cellar claimed to see a column of Roman soldiers pass through the earth itself helmeted, armored, their sandals striking the ground with muted rhythm. He saw only their upper bodies at first, until he realized the floor had risen since their time, hiding the lower half of their legs beneath the soil. The vision was terrifying, but also strangely orderly. These were not shrieking spirits, but men on patrol. It was as though the duty itself had survived death, the rhythm of the march carrying on in the silence of centuries. The historian might call this story nothing more than invention, the product of imagination upon ruins. But the archivist cannot help but see the echo. For to be a Roman soldier on the wall was to march endlessly, through snow, through rain, through years without end. Perhaps that rhythm was imprinted upon the land. Perhaps when the wind rises just so, and the ground is damp with rain, the echo comes again. Tramp, T-R-A-P, tramp, like the beating of a heart that will not stop. Even as the Roman world dissolved, the wall did not vanish. The stones were plundered, yes, hauled away to build cottages, barns, and churches. But in that plundering, the wall lived on. To this day, you can find Roman stone in farmhouses, in sheep pens, in the very fabric of northern villages. The empire that sought permanence found it in an unexpected way not in surviving intact, but in dissolving into the lives of those who came after. And perhaps the ghosts felt this too. Their barracks dismantled, their forts hollowed, but their stones still standing, their duty still whispered. By the Middle Ages, the wall was a ruin, a curiosity. Chroniclers wrote of it with awe, unsure who had built such a thing. Some said it was the work of giants. Others said it was the boundary between gods and men. Still others whispered of soldiers who had never left. When memory fades, myth takes root. And in Britain's north, where the mists linger and the wind howls across the heather, myth never had far to travel. There is a quiet tragedy in this. For the soldiers themselves, life on the wall was not a legend, but a daily grind of cold, fear, and longing. They wrote to their families. They prayed for protection. They loved, they fought, they died. And yet, in time, they were remembered not as men, but as shadows. It is a strange kind of immortality, one they never asked for, but one they received nonetheless. And perhaps that is what the Watchers truly are. Not spirits, not phantoms, but the embodiment of all that was endured here. The echo of empire itself, lingering not because of glory, but because of the simple, stubborn persistence of men who did what they were ordered to do. Hold the line. As the night deepens and we continue our watch, we must ask, is it the soldiers who haunt the wall? Or is it Rome itself, unable to let go of its dream of eternity? By the 5th century, Rome was gone. The legions had withdrawn, called back to defend Italy itself as barbarians closed in on the eternal city. Britain was left to fend for itself. The wall, once alive with torches and orders, fell silent. Grass grew between the stones. Owls nested in the empty towers. The soldiers' children, left behind, melted into the local tribes, carrying with them fragments of Roman speech, Roman habits, Roman prayers. The empire did not end in fire. It dissolved like mist at sunrise. And yet the wall remained. It could not vanish. Too vast, too stubborn, too heavy. A scar on the land that no storm could erase. Travelers in the Middle Ages spoke of it with reverence, as though it were a relic from some forgotten age of giants. Monks walking its length whispered of voices on the wind, of torches glimpsed in the distance where no living men kept watch. Shepherds swore they saw helmets gleam in moonlight, and when frightened children asked who the shadows were, their parents answered simply, "They are the Watchers." The soldiers who never left. The legend endured because it spoke to something deeper than history. Empires fall, kings die, castles crumble, but the idea of duty, of vigilance, of men who could not lay down their burden, that lingers. It is both comfort and warning. Comfort because the wall is never empty. Warning because to bind men to a dream of empire is to chain them beyond the grave. Archaeology, of course, offers the tangible remnants. Sandals worn thin, dice tossed aside in boredom, writing tablets pleading for socks and cloaks. These are human traces, fragile as breath. But alongside them, the stories live on. The man in the York cellar, the phantom cohorts glimpsed in the mist, the sensation still reported by walkers today that one is not alone upon the wall, that eyes unseen still watch. Perhaps this is why Hadrian's wall continues to fascinate us. It is not merely a ruin. It is a liminal space, a threshold between worlds, between empire and wilderness, between memory and forgetting, between the living and the dead. Those who stood upon it felt this liminality in their bones. They were Romans, yet they were also Britons. They were conquerors, yet also captives of the frontier. They lived as both soldiers and settlers, both oppressors and fathers, both strangers and kin. No wonder their presence lingers still, as if undecided, unwilling to depart. And so, as we close the pages of this exhibit, the image remains. A line of soldiers, marching where no road remains, their figures dim against the stars. Not violent, not vengeful, simply steadfast. Shadows carved out of duty, striding eternally across the stones. The watchers of Hadrian's wall. History tells us they were men, bound by orders, enduring the harshest edge of empire. Myth tells us they are still there, guarding a frontier that no longer needs guarding. And perhaps both are true, for the wall is both ruin and monument, both grave and ghost. In the Archive of Folly, we linger on this paradox, that what is most human in us, the longing for safety, the clinging to duty, the ache of belonging can echo longer than the stones we build. The folly of empire is not that it falls, but that it convinces men they must sacrifice everything to hold the line against time itself. And when they do, their echoes cannot help but remain. Thank you for keeping watch with me tonight, here at the edge of the empire. If you would walk further into the haunted corridors of history, you are welcome to remain with the archive. For here, the past is never silent. It marches still, step by step, into the long night.